Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Well, this episode is part of the series on my channel called Type 1 Diabetics Talk, where both host and guests are type 1 diabetic, and we discuss type 1 diabetes and related topics. Well, today's guest has lived with type 1 diabetes for 77 years. You heard it right, 77 years. He's from Kingston, New York. He's a passionate diabetes advocate, and he's the author of Beating the Odds, where he talks about his diabetes journey, and he writes blogs on Facebook about diabetes management and his observations and thoughts. And he is also a medalist from Joslin Diabetes Center. Richard Vaughn, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Thank you. I'm pleased to communicate with you today. I'm looking forward to this.
I'm delighted. I can't tell you how delighted I am, Richard. Richard, you've lived with type 1 for 77 years. So how old were you when you were diagnosed?
I was diagnosed in 1945. It was just a few days after my 6th birthday.
Mm-hmm. I was diagnosed at 5, so hopefully I can make it to 77 and be a veteran type 1 like yourself one day. Richard, it wasn't easy to diagnose you with type 1 in those days. So take us through your journey of diagnosis, please.
I had a very unhealthy childhood. I had 3 different kinds of measles before I was 3 years old. I had chicken pox and mumps when I was 4 years old. I had tonsils removed also that year. That was a very rough year.
Right.
And while I was recovering, I began showing symptoms of diabetes. And I think it was the unhealthy childhood that caused my pancreas to stop producing insulin.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they had a test back then to determine how much insulin a person's body was producing. But my parents took me to a doctor and had no idea what was wrong with me. He had no idea either. He prescribed a tonic to encourage me to eat because I had stopped eating. That is in extreme cases, diabetics tend to not have an appetite and they don't want to eat. A second and a third doctor, same story. After 3 doctors, none of them had a clue. They had no idea what was wrong with me. Our 4th doctor thought maybe I had diabetes. That was the first time we had ever heard the word. He had my blood tested. It was extraordinarily high. I wish I knew the number from back then, but I don't think I ever heard the number. Anyway, I was diagnosed and told by that doctor that I should go to the hospital immediately, and there would be a doctor there that would administer insulin and get me started to become healthy again, hopefully. And it worked out very well. Took pork insulin.
Yes.
And it saved my life. I got to feeling better very soon after I had started receiving the insulin. And in just a few days, I had lost so much weight. My ribs were very obvious. And I was like a skeleton. And I started gaining weight. And over a period of about a week, I was on my feet again. I wasn't able to walk until I started receiving insulin. It worked very well. And I used pork insulin from pigs for 50 years, from 1945 until, from 1945 to 1995. And that's when I started using Humalog insulin. And so that's my beginning story.
When I was diagnosed in 1978, the first insulin I was on was also pork insulin. 1978. It was either pork or bovine, but it may have been, I remember it being pork insulin. And then we switched to the synthetic insulins in the 90s, but it was pork insulin. Richard, how did you, so what was your insulin sort of protocol? Did you just inject once a day?
Yes, I have read other people saying that they were from way back then were required to inject more than once per day, but my doctor said once per day. Pork insulin was a 24-hour insulin. It did work for that length of time. So it did kind of make sense even now that once per day should be sufficient. But some diabetics were supposed to test their urine and then test more than once per day. I wish I had tried that. I think I would have been more successful with more than one injection.
Mm-hmm. I was on one injection when I was first diagnosed. 30 years after your diagnosis, maybe 35 years later, I was on one injection per day. Now, there wasn't an insulin pump back then. So we're going back to the 1940s. Take us down memory lane. So what kind of syringes did you use? Did you ever use the metal and glass ones with long needles?
Yes, I think the needles were almost 3/4 of an inch long. I guess what would that be in centimeters? 2.5 centimeters, perhaps.
Right.
And yes, a glass syringe.
That's right.
And the glass syringe was then put in water and boiled and sterilized each week. And it was kept immersed in alcohol between times that it was sterilized. And it worked very well. We had problems. We lived on a little farm and we had our own well water. And in that well water, there was a lime deposit. The lime made the glass syringe become very clouded, sort of a white film on the inside, and it was hard to read the units when I was loading the syringe. Also, the lime deposit caused the needles to become clogged.
Mm-hmm.
And I would inject and push the syringe and nothing happened. It was clogged. I had to pull it out of my leg. I had to put a fine little wire through the needle to unclog it, put the needle back on and start all over again. That was an aggravation.
And then came the disposable syringes, right?
Oh, yes. I used the glass syringe, though, for many years.
Right.
I think that the disposable syringe became available and I didn't know about it. Maybe my doctor didn't know about it. He knew how to get me working with insulin, but he didn't seem to really know that much about diabetes. He was just a general practitioner.
Right.
He was my family doctor. He treated all of the members of my family. And he had very little knowledge of what was new in the world of diabetes. So I didn't find out about the disposable syringes for quite some time. And I didn't know about something called test tape. You would put urine on a strip of tape and it would turn various colors.
Right.
I didn't know about that, but I found out much later in life that that was available long before I learned about it. So I was a slow learner.
But that wasn't your fault. You just didn't
Yes.
have the right professionals around you. So at what point were you referred to an endocrinologist?
Let's see, 2007.
Right.
That was the first. That was the first time I had even heard of an endocrinologist. 2007. Isn't that amazing? I'm sure they existed long before that, but I knew nothing about it. I didn't learn much about diabetes from my doctor, but when I found out that there was diabetes online, I started learning from my fellow diabetics. People like you were teaching me things I did not know. So under those circumstances, I think it's amazing that I not only lived with diabetes all that time, but I did not develop any complications.
For me, that's the most amazing or incredible, actually, part of your story, Richard, that after 77 years, you're really not suffering any diabetes complications. So you must have done something right.
Well, I started developing complications when I started Humalog.
Right.
I had none on the pork insulin, but I had complications with the fast-acting insulin that I use today. I developed neuropathy in many parts of my body. Neuropathy was diagnosed. In fact, in the year 2010, my neurologist tested me. He gave me, I think it's called an EMG test, and determined that my neuropathy was what he calls severe in my feet and legs. It causes me to have poor balance. I don't have much pain with neuropathy. I have very poor balance and very weak muscles. Now, I don't consider that a serious complication. I can still walk. I don't use a cane or a walker. I can still get around. I can do things, but I don't have much strength in my arms. I can't lift very much. I tried for a long time to exercise at a gym, but I couldn't on the machines. I couldn't use much weight. So, but it was good for me. And I take walks now, but I don't use a cane, but I don't walk more than 20 minutes. I get too tired. My muscles are just not there for me. They're not very strong, but I'm 83 years old. So maybe it's age.
Well, I think compared to people your age, other 83-year-olds, you're doing fantastically well.
Even without diabetes, I guess I'm doing very well.
That's what I'm trying to say. So compared to other people your age, you're doing remarkably well. So how about retinopathy? Any signs of retinopathy? Your eyes?
I don't have any problems with my eyes. They're healthy. My kidneys are good. Just neuropathy, that's the only complication I have.
So, Richard, you must have gone to your doctor at least once a year for a checkup, being a type 1 diabetic. And I'm going back when you were still a child or a teenager. So
Yes.
what tests did they do? Because the hemoglobin A1C wasn't available back then. That came about in the 1970s. So what did they do the urine stick test?
He took a sample of blood.
Blood.
He went over to one end of his office, used, I think he was using a microscope, and he tested that blood and got my blood sugar level. So he was able to do that back in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And he would come back. He wouldn't give me a number. He says, "You are running very, very high."
Hi. Mm.
And that's the only thing he would tell me. And he said that every time I went in, like you said, once per year, I went in for flus and colds, but for diabetes, I only went to see him once per year.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know any other diabetics. I bet you did. I didn't know any other diabetics, either type 1 or type 2, while I was growing up. I started meeting them online in 2006. That was the year I first started talking to other diabetics. So that was a lot of years just dealing with it all by myself.
Richard, when your doctor told you or would tell you that you're running high, what was the recommendation? Was there any dietary recommendation? And also, did he ever attempt to perhaps increase your insulin dose?
He left it up to me.
Right.
Yeah, it was entirely up to me. And my parents were working with me until I was 10 years old. And then it was entirely up to me from that point on.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember?
I just remembered when we would put the glass syringe in a pan on the stove to sterilize with the boiling water. Sometimes we would forget that it was on the stove. The water would boil down, the glass syringe would break and pop, and little pieces of glass would fly all over the kitchen. I don't think anybody was ever hurt, but that did stop. That did happen several times. We always had a spare syringe in case that happened.
So do you remember increasing your insulin dose? And do you remember hypoglycemic episodes?
Yeah, well, that's very vague right now. I'm sure I did increase, but I don't remember how I decided when and how much I should increase. But I was running in the urine test with the test tube and dropped 8 drops of urine in a solution called Benedict solution, and put that in water and let it boil. And then I would get colors. Blue color meant I did not have any urine sugar. A green color, I had a little bit. Yellow, orange, red, and then a brownish color, which was the most difficult situation. I had red and brown too often in the morning before breakfast. I tested my urine sugar only once per day, took insulin depending on the result of the urine test, and I would take a larger dose for the reds and browns and a smaller dose for the blues and greens. And that was the way I determined how much insulin to take.
It's interesting that there was some attempt to adjust insulin. So when did you first have your glucometer?
Glucose meter?
That's right.
I started using it in 2015. So that was 8 years ago. When did you start using yours?
Maybe 20 years ago.
Oh, really? It was available that long ago?
Well,
Okay.
The finger poking thing.
Oh,
That's what I mean, the
oh,
glucometer.
I thought you were talking about continuous glucose meter.
No, no.
Um, the finger pricking, oh, that was in the early 1980s.
Right, because they only came about in the 1970s. I think I had one in the 1990s, but I never used it. I think it was just something in the cupboard. I didn't see the relevance. I never used it. The ignorance was rampant back then. I truly was oblivious of my blood sugars. So I wish I knew better back then. But do you wear a CGM now?
Yes,
You do.
I do. I have one. I use the Dexcom, and they're coming out with a new model later this year, and I'm anxious to give it a try. I have some difficulty with my CGM. It's not as accurate as I think it should be. And I don't know whether it has anything to do with where do I put the sensor on my body. I've tried my abdomen, I've tried my upper part of my legs, and it doesn't seem to make much difference. I have trouble with some of the sensors, and I tend to have numbers on my sensor that are much lower than the blood test.
Mm. So would you rather switch back to finger poking?
I do use finger pricking. I'd use it before each meal.
Right.
And at bedtime.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I use finger pricking before I drive my car.
Mm-hmm.
Accuracy is very important under all of those circumstances. And in between, the Dexcom, the CGM will give me numbers that are accurate enough that I can make do with them under those circumstances.
Right. So let's talk about your insulin now. So are you still using the Humalog?
Yes, I've used Humalog starting in 1995. I've used it ever since. I haven't used any other kind. I'm very satisfied with it.
So you're using the Humalog to cover your meals. How about your background insulin?
Well, I use it to correct highs and for my meals. I use 1 unit for every 10 carbohydrates.
Right.
But in the morning, I have especially high blood sugar, and it seems like 1 unit for 10 carbs is not good enough. So I have a different ratio. I use 1 for 7 in the morning and 1 for 10 the rest of the day.
Right, Richard. So you're using a pump, right?
Yes.
Right, right. So you for a pump user, you only ever need one type of insulin in your pump. I use the Omnipod with NovoRapid in it, which is very similar to Humalog.
Mm-hmm.
So what pump is your pump?
Yeah, this is a Medtronic pump.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are using pumps that will automatically give you insulin if you're high, and it's connected with a CGM. There's a CGM included with the pump. They work together. And it will also stop the delivery of your basal insulin if you're running low.
Yes.
So I haven't tried that yet. Are you trying that?
No, I haven't tried it yet either. I do have a CGM and I have a tubeless pump, but they don't speak with each other. They don't talk to each other.
I see. All right. Is that the Omnipod?
It is the Omnipod.
Okay. Yeah. Do you like it?
I like the tubeless parts of it. I used the Medtronic before. I loved my Medtronic, but when I tried the Omnipod, I loved it more because you can stick it anywhere. You don't have to worry about the tube. And very active. So I don't want to worry about the tube. This works fine for me.
Okay. I
Richard,
haven't, it's about time for me to start using a new pump.
right.
I've used this one 5 years, and that's usually the amount of time I wait before changing to a new pump. I haven't decided whether to use the Omnipod or maybe the tandem pump.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the two that will work automatically. I haven't decided whether to do that because I'm doing so well with the system I'm using. Why should I change?
Why change something that's working?
Yes, I agree.
Richard, I want to go back to your childhood or maybe your teenage years. Did you ever receive any dietary recommendations?
Recommendation from doctors?
From doctors regarding your diet?
Oh, that doctor that I was with for so long never recommend. The only order he gave me was to don't eat sugar.
Sugar.
That's all I had to go on. That meant I could eat anything I wanted if it didn't have sugar in it. So I didn't eat candy or ice cream, but I drank, we were on a farm, I drank our own cow's milk. Now that's not good for diabetes, but I didn't know that. It didn't have sugar. Milk doesn't have sugar in it, so I thought it was safe. I ate rice. I ate pasta. My mother made a lot of spaghetti and macaroni dishes. I ate all of those things, and it's not good. I ate a lot of bread, things that I shouldn't eat. And I know better now, but I didn't know back then. And so I ran a lot of blood sugar. That's why I was getting those reds and browns in the test tube for urine testing. And I didn't have a doctor who advised me how I should eat until this century. So that meant, I think it was 55 years in the previous century, I had no knowledge of how I should eat. Just avoid sugar, and I thought that was all I had to do. I bet from the very beginning, you had a better knowledge of how you should eat.
Yes, in the 70s, my mother was given a sheet when I was diagnosed. The hospital gave her a sheet of foods which were safe, like eggs and cheese and meat and fish, and foods which she should limit, which were rice and bread. So they were to be limited. And of course, sugars was a big no. So I remember that. But so when did you learn about carbohydrates and that carbohydrates convert into sugar, glucose in your body? When did you learn that?
In the late 1980s, around 1988, I read about it in a magazine.
Right.
Doctors didn't know about it, but I read about it in a magazine. I think I was in a doctor's office and there was a pile of magazines on the table. And I picked up one and started reading. That's where I learned about it. That was the first time I knew anything about carbohydrates and that it had something to do with diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
So in reading that article, I learned there were certain foods that I should avoid. And I didn't get much of information from it. I probably told my doctor, I don't remember. I wish I could remember. Maybe he gave me some information too, but he never had before I learned about this from the magazine.
So did you then limit your carbohydrates?
Well, I don't know if I started looking at labels and determining how many carbohydrates one serving would give me. I don't know whether I started looking at that then. But once I got into online communication with other diabetics and saw what they were doing, then I immediately began doing that. And I developed my ratios I mentioned earlier. I needed 1 unit of insulin for 10 carbs, and that seems to still be working very well for me now.
So, Richard, so now you do you eat carbohydrates and you try to cover them with insulin, or do you try to limit your carbohydrates?
If my blood sugar is reasonably low, I will eat some things, not candy, not ice cream. I will eat some things like pasta and more bread than I would normally eat.
Mm-hmm.
I like potato chips. I'll eat some things like that. But if my blood sugar is, let's say, 150 or higher, no. Now, of course, you'd use a different kind of scale. I'm using, let's see, how do you determine?
Oh, I'll convert. Don't worry. I've got a conversion chart. I'll put it in the description below.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
When I eat a meal, I like to be less than 100 on my scale. If I'm over 100, I tend to go as high as 170 or 180 on my scale. So I want to be as low as I can be and feel good and be safe before I start eating a meal.
Mm-hmm. 150 is 8.3. So Richard is saying that if he's in the 8s, then he will avoid the carbohydrates at mealtime. But if he's anything lower, maybe in the 5s or under 100, right? Then you'll go for a portion of pasta or rice.
Mm-hmm. And when I'm low, even between meals, that's when I get to eat some ice cream.
Right.
Or something like that. I eat a lot of fruit. Now,
Right.
that's probably my favorite thing to eat. I like all kinds of fruit. And I do eat meat. I don't eat tremendous portions of meat. But I was told by my doctor when I was young that I could eat all the meat that I wanted. And we lived on a farm, so we had lots of meat. We had chicken, we had pork, and we had beef, all from our own farm. We had a pig pen with 2 big pigs. We had 3 cows. We had a chicken house with 12 chickens. And so we had lots and lots of meat. So I ate a lot of meat as a kid, but I don't eat as much meat now as I did back then.
Mm-hmm. Well, that must have done some good, to your health as a child, because you were kind of oblivious to your blood, what your blood sugars were doing. So having access to fresh foods and real whole foods must have worked well, right?
Mm-hmm, it did. Oh, I want to talk about something else. In the late 1900s, not long after I started using Humalog, I started gaining weight.
Mm.
It wasn't because I was eating too much. In fact, I started eating less because I didn't want to gain weight, but I kept on gaining. And I gained and I gained. I gained a lot of weight. My waist size went from 32 to 44. Can you believe that? A lot of weight gain. My doctor diagnosed me with insulin resistance.
Right.
That is a type 2 characteristic, but a lot of type 1 diabetics do have insulin resistance. My doctor started me on metformin.
Right.
I'm taking metformin now. 2 years after I started metformin, I was losing weight. I lost all the weight that I had gained. Now my waist size is 37, and that's a lot better than it was before. So I have read that there is a significant number of type 1 diabetics with insulin resistance. I had 4 relatives with type 2, 4 relatives, all older than me, with type 2. I think I inherited a gene which led to my insulin resistance. And why did it appear in the late 1990s but never had prior to that? Was it because I was now using a different kind of insulin? I haven't figured that out yet. I've asked other diabetics, some of whom have had the same experience, and it seems that they have type 2 relatives also. And I think it was an inherited gene. And that gene was there in my body, just waiting for a trigger to erupt. And that trigger was weight gain. And what would have caused the weight gain? I'm blaming it on the human-log insulin. There was no other change in my life. I wasn't eating more than usual. I changed insulins. And the human-log insulin may have caused me to gain weight. That combined, well, it may have triggered the gene, and then the gene caused me to gain weight, the insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a real turning point in my life. Very annoying.
I have many type 2 diabetics in both sides of my family. And so I have the genetic predisposition to develop type 2 diabetes. I'm well aware of that. So this is why I do whatever I can to avoid that diagnosis. So I'm active. I keep my carbohydrate consumption super low. And I also do regular fasting. So far, I've avoided it. And of course, I don't have excess weight either. So I'm doing well so far.
Yes, very good. Okay.
Yeah, so far it's all good. Right. So Richard, you were the only child in your town, would you say, who had type 1 diabetes at the time? What was it like growing with the disease? And knowing or thinking that you're the only one with it?
I have no relatives, to my knowledge, that have type 1. And like I said, I had 4 with type 2. But no, my children, 2 sons, no diabetes. My wife has no diabetes of any type among her relatives. No type 1s, no type 2s. My sons and my grandchildren have no diabetes symptoms whatsoever. So I'm very happy about that. I think my type 1 diabetes was caused by the unhealthy childhood with the diseases I had. It's not a type 1 diabetes that I have more or less inherited. I know families that have several children with type 1 and lots of relatives with type 1. It almost seems like it's inherited. But a type 1 diabetic that evolves with unhealthy childhood, it's not going to be passed on to other family members. So everybody is safe. And I think it's my history that explains why they are safe.
Richard, for you, what was it like growing up with type 1 diabetes when you were a child at school? How did you manage it when you were going to school?
I was very brittle. You familiar with that term?
Yeah.
My doctor called me a brittle diabetic. My blood sugar would drop low with too much exercise.
Mm.
So he wrote an excuse for me to be excluded from gymnastics and play period. And I did not play with the other kids because playing would cause my blood sugar to drop. So I had that note every year throughout my first 7 years of school. In high school, I started participating with gym, but I did have some reactions. And so I talked to my doctor. He said that maybe you should not participate in high school either. So I didn't. And in college, I was still having that problem. I have a problem now. If I walk around the block and get home, if I have walked for a half hour, my blood sugar has dropped. Not a dangerous amount. I have to make sure that it's high enough before I do an exercise routine. So I've developed a routine that makes it safe for me. I exercise only when I have higher blood sugar.
So in your school days or even during high school, you would have taken your one injection in the morning at home and then go to school or college, right? Is that what you did?
Uh-huh. And I never had a bad problem in high school or grade school or high school because I wasn't participating in gym.
Mm.
And it's safe. In college, I was a sophomore and I was taking a course, calculus. I was a math major.
Mm-hmm.
And my first test in calculus, I started having low blood sugar. It was so bad, I couldn't read the test paper. My vision was blurred. You ever get blurred vision with low
Yes.
blood sugar?
Yes.
I couldn't read the test paper. So I walked up to the front of the room and told my teacher, I'm having an insulin reaction. I can't read the test paper. He didn't believe me. I guess he thought I hadn't studied.
Mm-hmm.
I had an F on that test because I didn't take the test, and he did not agree that I should be given a retest. That was the only F I ever made on a math test. So I had a B in the course that could have been an A. That was very frustrating. That is the only time I think that my diabetes interfered with me in school.
So when did you meet your wife?
After I had 6 years of college, I had a master's degree in math. I wanted to do something. There were no computers back then. I would have loved to have been into computers, but they didn't exist. It was 1963 when I graduated with my master's degree. I went back to the college where I had my undergraduate work done, and I told him I didn't know what I was going to do. What kind of a job should I get? And he said, well, teach summer school here at this college. The fellow I had hired to do that summer school teaching has just found out he has cancer. He will not be teaching. You will be his substitute. That scared me. I did not think that I could be a teacher. I was like, the first day I walked into the classroom that summer, the summer of '62, I was panicking. My legs were wobbling, and I made my way through the class. I learned to like teaching. I learned to like it. I became a teacher, and after I got my master's degree, I looked for a college level teaching position. And I found one at a school called Bridgewater College in Northern Virginia, here in the United States. Teachers were allowed to date students. So I looked at the college yearbook and I saw some pretty girls. So I started making some phone calls and I was dating two of the girls that I saw in the college catalog. I dated a girl named Wanda. She was a junior. I dated a girl named Anita. She was a sophomore. I fell in love with Anita. We have now been married 59 years.
It's amazing. That's amazing. So how did you reveal your type 1 diabetes to Anita?
She knew nothing about diabetes. There was no diabetes in her family. Her parents knew very little about it. She had to learn. She asked me lots of questions. She learned a little bit at a time, and she saw me have seizures.
Right.
After our marriage.
Mm.
I would have a seizure occasionally. And she learned to take care of me and bring me out of a seizure. I had a lot of seizures when I was growing up. I would have them at night. The pork insulin was a 24-hour insulin, and it worked the same throughout the 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I was having the effect in the nighttime that I had previously in the daytime, but I wasn't eating.
Mm.
So that's why I would drop so low at night. I had to eat a heavy snack before I went to bed. And then in the middle of the night, I could still go low. So I had terrible seizures. My parents had a very difficult time bringing me out of those seizures. And my wife had difficulty after our marriage several different times until I started knowing about carbs and regulated my food and my insulin accordingly. I started having fewer seizures. And when I started using the fast-acting Humalog and knew how to use it properly, my seizures stopped. I haven't had a seizure now for a very long time.
So do you now go for A1C test once a year?
I have an A1C test 3 times per year.
3 times. Mm-hmm.
My first one was in 1980. And my A1Cs ran in the 10s and 11s. I think my highest was at 11.5.
Oh,
And
that's high. That's high.
yeah, it is. It is very high. And when I started using the Humalog insulin and regulating my dosages properly, my A1Cs came down, down, down. And I was in the 5.5 to 6.4 range. The highest I have had in a long time now was a 6.4, and the lowest was a 5.3. That's a good range, but you have to be careful.
Amazing.
If you're running too low, you may be having blood sugar that's too low.
True. True. So what's your personal target blood sugar? What do you want to get to? So if you're low, okay, so if you're low, you need to bring your blood sugar up to that level, or if you're high, you need to bring your blood sugar down to that level. What would you say your target level is?
My range that I have set on my my continuous glucose monitor is 70 to 170.
Right.
I don't want to ever go over 170. I don't want to ever go below 70. And I'm in that range more than 90% of the time. And I'm satisfied with that. But I still do occasionally have numbers like in the 60s and occasionally in the high 50s. I can take care of those very easily. And I can have numbers, especially after breakfast. I have trouble with breakfast. I can have a number after breakfast that was in the 180s. I see that occasionally. So I have to delay lunch and I have to take a correction dose of insulin to take care of that and eat lunch late under those circumstances.
So, so how do your grandchildren or children, and when your children were younger and now your grandchildren, how do they see granddad with diabetes? What do they think of the diabetes part?
My children were so accustomed to seeing me take shots and test my blood sugar. They were so accustomed to it. It was nothing. That's the way it's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And they never ask questions. They just pass on by. And oh, dad is taking another shot. Ho ho. My grandchildren live so far from me, they don't really see me doing anything with my diabetes equipment. They see me wear a pump on my belt, but they know nothing else about it.
Right.
I don't think they even know what diabetes is.
Mm-hmm. May they not know for a very long time. So, okay.
My granddaughter is will be 20 next month. She is a sophomore at the Edinburgh University in Scotland.
That's amazing. Yes, you shared that with me, and you're very proud of her. That's amazing. Richard, I'd like you to tell us about the Joslin Diabetes Center and your involvement with them. So they were running a study and you participated in the study, right? So tell us more about what happened.
Okay, they call it the Joslin Medalist Study. Every participant has the 50-year Joslin Medal. So every participant has had type 1 diabetes for 50 years or more. Mm-hmm. They tested 1,000 individuals under those circumstances. 1,000 people were invited to Boston, where the Joslin Diabetes Center is located. They participated. They had to fill out a lot of forms asking all about their past, their how they wanted to know, how do you exercise? What do you eat? Describe your diabetes in detail. Bring with you all the A1Cs you can get your hands on. Oh. They ask for such detail. Do you have diabetes in your family? Do you have relatives with diabetes? Are any of them type 1? And there were pages and pages of questions like that. It was very, very thorough. They gave me a glucose tolerance test. That was part of what took place there. They wanted to determine whether some type 1 diabetics of long duration may possibly still produce some insulin. Mm-hmm. So the glucose tolerance test gave them that information. They tested me every 30 minutes after I drank the glucose and watched what happened, watched the blood test. Some of the participants had their blood sugar drop significantly a couple of hours after they had drank the glucose. it was determined that they still produce some insulin. So we have type 1 diabetics of long duration who still produce some insulin, but they don't produce enough that they can stop taking insulin. They're still insulin dependent. But more than 50% of the subjects that had been tested after their first 500 people were tested, more than 50% of them were producing some amount of insulin. I was one of those producing zero insulin. My insulin, my blood sugar kept increasing after I drank the glucose and went up into the 400s. I had blood sugar in the 400s 2 hours after I had the glucose tolerance test. That testing was done in the year 2013 and again in the year 2017. Same thing happened both times. I told them that if I ever participate again, I absolutely refuse to do the glucose tolerance test.
They award you something for being a veteran?
No, they just award the medals for the number of years you have been type 1.
Right.
They have 50, 75, and 80-year medals.
Right.
I have the 50 and 75.
Hey, that's good.
And in 3 more years, I will have an 80-year medal.
81. That's brilliant. Well, good luck. Good luck, Richard. Now, were you able to bring any of your past A1Cs?
Yes. The doctor I had back then, in his files, he had my A1Cs. I told him about the Jocelyn Medalist program and that they wanted to know my A1Cs. And I asked him if he could make out a chart with the date and the A1C for as many as he could find. I don't think he was too overjoyed about having to do that, but he did. He didn't use a typewriter or a computer. He just wrote it out with a pencil on a piece of paper. They accepted it at Jocelyn, and I gave them a whole lot of A1Cs, probably more than most other participants. So they had a good record of my diabetes under those circumstances.
That's incredible. That's really incredible that he was able to dig out all that information.
Yes.
Can you tell our audience about your book before we wrap this up?
Oh, the book that I wrote?
Mm-hmm.
It's called Beating the Odds. And it was published in March of 2010. That was 13 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the subtitle is, at that time, I had been a type 1 for 64 years.
Right.
Now it's 77 years.
Mm-hmm.
The subtitle was 64 Years of Diabetes Health. A lot of people have bought it. On Facebook, I've made a lot of friends, and they ask me, they read the things that I write, and they say, well, you should write a book. So I tell them, oh, I did. And so they learned that I've written the book, and a lot of them have bought it. It's on Amazon. You can find my book.
So I will put the link below so my audience can just click on the link and support you and purchase the book. And indeed, I'm going to do that right away too.
Okay.
Well, Richard, it's been a wonderful 1 hour, I think just over an hour together. Thank you so much for your insights, for your wisdom, and for the stories from the past and present. I really appreciated it.
Well, I've enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me speak with you today.
Thank you, Richard. So you have a beautiful afternoon in New York. And I'll be in touch. Bye for now.
Do that. Thank you.